Thank you all for being here. As she mentioned, my name is Amy Hinojosa, and I'm the President and CEO of MANA, a National Latina organization, and we proudly serve as coalition members of the HTTP Coalition. So our first conversation today is going to be about the future of privacy, and you're in for a real treat to kick the day off. You know, there's an old adage here in Washington that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that this conversation about privacy really encapsulates that conversation, because from the moment you pick up your phone in the morning, it's the first thing we all do. When the alarm goes off, we turn it off and we start to check our messages. And we start to scroll through social media, and we start to look at all the things that we have to do for the day. Providing data points at every turn from that point forward until we end our days. And the conversation of what happens to that information, who gets it, who sells it, who buys it, what happens to it. These are all things that need to be discussed if we're going to talk about how we really protect consumers moving forward. And so I'm very thrilled to introduce our three panelists that we have today. They're, you know, not only are they partners in this work, but they are friends in addition. So first we have Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, Director of the Center for Technology Innovation and Senior Fellow of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. We also have Carlos Gutierrez, Deputy Director and General Counsel of LGBTTech, and BAGCHI, Vice President of Technology Policy at the Chamber of Progress, who will be moderating our discussion. So these folks are legitimately the smartest people in pretty much any room. So we're very thrilled to have them as part of the conversation. And I will turn the program over to KJ. So thank you all very much.
Hey folks, good afternoon. My name is BAGCHI, as Amy mentioned. I'm the Vice President of Technology Policy at the Chamber of Progress. We're a center-left technology industry trade association committed to technology's progressive future. I wanted to quickly thank HTTP for hosting us today. Congratulations to its board for such an amazing event today, full of amazing talent and important conversations that impact our communities. And also thanks as always to Judan and Chris for bringing us together for, again, an important topic around privacy. I'm of course joined by our esteemed panel, and I'll turn it over to them in a second, but I wanted to lay the groundwork a little bit about our discussion today on privacy. Now, privacy can appear to be a very dry topic from afar until you're the person that finds yourself having very little of it. We think about privacy in our homes, in our bedrooms, our places of worship, and other areas that have cultural significance. We strive to enjoy our lives with little corporate or government intrusion. Now, in the digital context, privacy becomes front and center in our minds every time we get a notice about the latest company having a massive data breach implicating our personal data. Beyond that, our digital lives require us to give up a little bit of privacy and enjoy the products and services we use on a daily basis. And for the most part, we seem to be okay with that until that information is weaponized against us, and we find our communities unable to access jobs, housing, credit, or educational institutions. Now, our country has no national comprehensive privacy law on the books. Instead, we have a sectoral approach that impacts certain industries and institutions. Think healthcare or banking and finance. Now, in this absence, states have begun to fill the void. And by my calculation, about 12 states have passed comprehensive legislation, and 5 are actively enforcing their own laws. But is that enough? Now, to put things into further perspective, I want to share a story that was reported on Friday in the Wall Street Journal. The publication identified a network of brokers and advertising exchanges who collected data from users and had that data flow from apps on our phone to the Defense Department and intelligence agencies through a company called Near Intelligence. The paper noted connections between the company and government contractors and how data sucked up through these ad exchanges were then siphoned to government entities. This is not the first time this has happened. The FBI, Homeland Security, and ICE have all purchased data on American residents from data brokers. This is technically not illegal. So when we talk about privacy in the digital space, it's important that we focus not only on the private sector and industry, but also on how our own government can collect that information. Today's panel will discuss the important work being done to protect our communities and how we can envision a future of privacy from both industry and the government where we are all protected. I'll turn it over now to our panelists to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and their work, and I'll join you folks shortly. Let's start off with Carlos. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and think about, if you could also go through how you think about this issue of privacy and how it impacts the community that you represent.
Great, thank you. Thank you, KJ, and thank you, Nicole, and thank you so much to HTTP for hosting this amazing gathering. It is such an important gathering, and to have a focus on marginalized communities is just not something you get a lot of in DC, so this makes this even much more important. My name is Carlos Gutierrez. I am the Deputy Director and General Counsel for the LGBT Technology Partnership. We are the largest national organization that works at the intersection of LGBT rights and technology rights. And we focus a lot on this question about data protection and how it is different for marginalized communities. And I would say that for the first 7 years of LGBT's life, what I did most was explain to people why is privacy different for marginalized communities, or why is it not the same for everyone? And our answer is that marginalized communities have a very conflicted relationship with privacy and with data. We have all experienced data breaches and abuses by government and companies. We are all much more vulnerable to having negative outcomes from those breaches. LGBT communities especially have an issue around this, because being outed against your will or having data that releases your sexual orientation or gender identity could cost you your family, it can cost you your job, it can cost you, it can be criminalized in over 69 countries in the world. So privacy is not just an issue about preferences. It really is kind of a basic right that marginalized communities are always butting up against, and making sure that those communities are heard and protected is the goal of LGBT Tech.
Thanks for that, Carlos, and setting that stage. I'm Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. And I am honored and humbled to be on this panel to the invitation of our dear friend, Judan from HTTP. And it's good to see people in person. I do have the caveat, at 1:30 I'm going to have to leave because due to the potential shutdown, we have the EEOC chairwoman coming to Brookings, and I need to be able to greet her. How do we start? I'm not going to say that I'm as old as Carlos.
Why?
But I will suggest,
Why?
I will suggest that he and I have been doing this work for many decades. And when we think about privacy and we look at how this has evolved over time, I think for many of us, as it was explained by KJ, privacy really was about having that digital asset that was protected. And those of us know how hard it is for vulnerable communities to sort of mitigate when those opportunities are foreclosed because someone has taken your identity. There are so many stories among African American and Latina families who have had to go through this laborious process to actually get their identity back. And we already know, as identity has become weaponized in this country, that that is an area that we just don't want to place as a burden on communities of color. Back then, when I was at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies almost a decade ago, we talked about privacy. And today, we are now talking about data privacy within a context of a technological ecosystem that is much more opaque and advanced. And that's why we're having this conversation. How do we have in the US a country without a data privacy standard? How have we not acknowledged the importance of people retaining some value to their personally identifiable information and their biometric cues? How are we having this conversation today when we know that the internet is primarily based on the circulation, the repurposing, and collection of our individual information? In fact, as my friend Amy often says when she's on the stage with us, we are subjects and commodities of this economy, and it's important that we actually have conversations on the preservation of our privacy. Many people want to leapfrog that and talk about artificial intelligence. I think what we're going to talk about today is the basic tenet, the foundation of what is actually added to the civil rights and the civil protections of people who look like us. With that in mind, at the center, we work on issues related to this, and we try to intersect them, particularly in my work, around technology and society. I also have a forthcoming book coming out on how this affects people who are on the wrong side of the digital divide. That will be out in February, Jim. Finally.
We're in it. We're in the book.
It will be published. But there is something to be said about people who are not online and what we actually consider the worth of their data and the extent to which they actually can participate And for those of us in this room, we know that when you are excluded, you are truly excluded, and you pay a tax on engaging in the digital economy. And so I think it's really safe to say that we are appreciative of this conversation. And our hope is that we'll have a national standard in privacy legislation at some point so that we can at least start with some guardrails of some of the foundational protections that come with being part of communities that have been overexploited, manipulated in many ways and in many respects.
So I appreciate the plug for the book. I'll give you a chance, Carlos, later if you need to use this airtime to plug anything you got coming down the pipe.
I'll plug NICOL's book too, so.
That's great.
Told me to.
Yeah, exactly. No, we talked a lot about, so we keep using this term comprehensive privacy legislation. If we can dig down a little bit more, you've both talked about how you're working on this issue as it impacts marginalized communities, but I really do think it's worth sort of double clicking on the question of like, why should communities of color care? And why do we talk about the term comprehensive privacy? I'll let Dr. NICOL Turnley go ahead and start.
I mean, I think it's an important conversation. And I think for many years, we've been trying to get something that was comprehensive that could be future-proofed into the evolution of the internet. You know, we're sort of at this disadvantage right now because not having any type of privacy or comprehensive privacy standard as to what is allowable and permissible, what is not, has made it very difficult for legislators to get their hands on it, which is probably why we've not gotten to where we are. We're actually closer, as my colleague Cam Carey says, but there are still like caveats of this that are sort of confounded with AI that we in this room should be concerned about. At the end of the day, as Carlos said, having comprehensive privacy legislation is like having comprehensive health insurance, right? It's not necessarily dictated what aspects in the most granular fashion are going to be protected because it still allows you the leeway to balance innovation with your individual privacy rights. But the challenge is how our data is collected, what is collected, how it's stored, the extent to which it's deleted are matters of concern. I sit on the National Academies of Sciences Research Commission on the use of facial recognition technology. And one of the things that we know is many of the mistakes that are made on communities of color have a lot to do with old photos, expired driver's license, expired, image data that brings in a kid who was 16 that may have some interaction institutionally. Now they're seen, because the technology is fallible, they're seen as a potential suspect. My point is having a comprehensive system that allows some clear guidelines on what is allowable, what is not, where are there disclosures that need to be made, really benefits us because we're just like, the Wild West of technology. You collect it, for some reason people think that we're okay with that. And we shouldn't be, because it does have what I consider to be systemic implications later if we actually don't do this right up front.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, there has got to be a standard that we can all rely on to protect our communities. And for the LGBTQ plus community, that's even more important. I know that we're probably going to talk about state lights at some point and the interaction. And while state lights are great, that my concern and what I talk about a lot is making sure that sexual orientation and gender identity data, SOGI data, is protected in these privacy laws and explaining why SOGI data is heightened sensitivity and why it should be protected. And having to do this on a state-by-state basis really leaves you exposed and vulnerable to the whims of that state. And let's be frank, the place where LGBTQ people are most vulnerable and really need this protection, reproductive health care and all these other things, are the states that are not going to be receptive to including sexual orientation and gender identity provisions in their law. If federal law gives predictability, it allows us to set at a very minimum, a standard that covers everyone so that that when you're traveling around the country, you have these protections. So it is important for marginalized communities, and that uniformity is really valuable because otherwise we're going to be fighting this battle on a state-by-state basis and hoping that we can get the things we want even from unreceptive legislators.
And can I just add on to, I think to your point, it's also important for us to have this conversation in our communities because as subjects of mass surveillance, particularly thinking about the Latino community, right? The fact that there are no guardrails for what can be collected, that has implications later in terms of this unfettered access and what that means for your safety, what that means for, you know, your civil rights and human rights safeguards. And I think for some reason legislators don't see that this is, you know, something that affects everybody across the United States. You know, my mother, my neighbor, but it really has huge implications for communities that were already vulnerable before the process of technology's evolution started.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, so let's talk about guardrails a little bit. I was going to ask about Congress and why they haven't been able to pass a privacy law yet, but I think given the circumstances we're in right now with a leaderless House, we don't need to really dig into why Congress has failed to put guardrails.
You think?
Why limit it to that law,
right? But I do want to talk about states, right? I think in our sort of policy bubble, we kind of understand inherently why states filling this void is not necessarily, it's not a bad thing, but it's not a great thing. And so, like, you know, Carlos touched on it a little bit, but again, using the lens of an impact on communities that, you know, are being surveilled, of course, communities that may not know what their rights are or what their access rights are when they go on a platform. Also, you know, think about communities that have limited English proficiency, right? And so why is it, I'm sort of teeing you guys up for the answer here, but like, again, why is it that 12 different privacy laws are not necessarily the best approach? I guess let's dig a little bit more into that, just to kind of break that down a little bit. I'll let Carlos start us off, and then.
Yeah, no, I think I touched a little bit in terms of just kind of the uniformity and the predictability. I don't want to have to figure out what the state law is for my privacy when I move from Maryland, which is going to be very protective of my rights, to Texas or Mississippi, which is not. So the fact that we don't have uniform and that we have to fight these fights on a state-by-state basis is a huge issue. It also speaks to the fact that when we start talking about state laws versus federal laws, there is a whole range of things that people are focused on and interested in. What Maine's law may cover may be very different than California. Obviously, California is like the 800-pound elephant in the room that when it comes to laws, and they flex their muscle. And when you're talking about why is it that we don't have a federal law, California is a part of that. You know, the California did not want to allow a federal law that would not allow them to have stronger protections than federal protections, and they scuttled it. So, I mean, it's fair enough. They want to have the protections that they want for their citizens, but if every state's doing this, it's going to be really hard to come to a consensus. That leads to the second point, being that the protections will be different based on where you are, and that's just not a workable system for anyone. Like, I don't know what my rights are as a professional in tech when I travel to different states, and I can't expect anyone else who's not in this world to know this or expect to be protected or not. So that uniformity is really important for that.
Yeah, I mean, and I would agree with Carlos. I mean, obviously, we want to avoid a patchwork or a quilt of various state laws that have different pressure points. One, for consumers who have to determine, well, will my privacy be protected here? Will it not be protected here? We also have to be concerned, and I'm going to say it, we have to be concerned about states fast forwarding 4 or 5 years later of imposing their own privacy laws in states that are very contentious to people of color, right? Who are, in other words, engaged in state and federal battles over control, which make it very difficult for federal government to come up with a standard if we have the challenge of preemption and other blockages that will stand in the way of us coming to agreement on something. For many of us in this room, we've watched this evolve primarily because the federal government has been slow to act, and the internet continues to grow, and people have real concerns about their privacy. Even folks in this room have seen a heightened awareness among people who are your family members who are concerned about their information. The challenge is, without comprehensive federal action, states are going to continue to come up with their own guidelines. And that will make it difficult for consumers, as Carlos has said, for protected groups, but for businesses that are owned by small businesses that are owned by many people in our communities who have to comply with those standards and have the legal funds if they actually fall out of line or have enforceable penalties. I think we're not getting that part of it. And I think part of the challenge that has happened, and again, as a sociologist, I kind of watch this with eyes wide open. A lot of what started with the privacy debate, dating back to when we started talking about this in 2016, It's not a new conversation. We've been talking about rules of the road for the internet when it came to private information for years. But the challenge today is defining those rules of the road in ways that companies cannot get around that, where is one of the challenges that we have in coming up with this and giving rights back to individuals, in particular, with things like private right of action, and what does that look like? I just think the more that Congress waits, it's going to be even more complicated. And our global counterparts are beating us. When China has a privacy law, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? And we're going to see in Latin America, for example, we're seeing privacy laws and data privacy laws. Why we can't get to that imagination here, I think will have, again, a detrimental impact on communities that have had blurred lines politically and socially and economically over the years.
No, I appreciate the context. So I want to lay, for folks in the audience, just to lay a little bit more detail on Congress and when privacy actually passed. And you guys can keep me honest. Congress got very close in 2019, and then COVID hit in 2020. And again, we expect our government institutions to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But with COVID hitting, that became the focus. The House got very close, I want to say last year, passing it out of committee. But in negotiations with the Senate side, it wasn't able to go, they weren't able to move forward. And so now in 2023, the big topic when it comes to Congress, in my opinion, is artificial intelligence. Senator Schumer is holding a number of forums. The White House is talking about this executive order. We keep hearing about it. And states, again, are beginning to pass laws where they're going to study the issue. Or they've introduced laws already saying our state, in state government, here are the limits, when it comes to AI systems. Is it going to be enough to have AI regulations, create guardrails around AI development, use, and deployment without national comprehensive privacy legislation? And again, just to give more details on, if we're talking about one type of AI system, generative AI, for example, which uses a lot of computing power, it's gathering data from a lot of sources. And right now you have the biggest tech companies are sort of the gatekeepers right now of that information. And so again, this question of what happens with their data when it gets sucked into these systems, there's a lot of focus right now on, well, let's create guardrails around AI and what it does with that deployment. But is that, and again, at the risk of stepping on our AI panel's toes later on, I do think there's some intersection here. And so I'd love, and Nicole sort of teed this up earlier, so I'll let Nicole kind of talk about it first. Is it enough to have an AI?
No, I think it's a dangerous conflation of AI and privacy legislation. Because I think for those of us in this room who work on AI, including myself, who are interested in the identification and mitigation of biases, that actually comes with another range of executable actions that we need to take, whether it is looking at the substack or the technological architecture and what those standards look there, or it's looking at the outcomes when it comes to civil rights and human liberties. If we had a standard core tenet of privacy legislation, it would actually give better guidance when it comes to the legal compliance with our civil rights laws, the type of information that can be collected, the intersectionality and the inferences that come with collecting information about, Latina LGBTQ people. There's a lot there that without comprehensive privacy legislation, it actually creates an additional rabbit hole that we're going to have to pass it no matter what. It will come before, it will come after, but it's not going to come with AI legislation, which brings me to a conversation, KJ, that you're sort of bringing up. What Congress is also talking about is children's privacy, right? And I keep thinking in my head, I'm going to wake up one day and they're going to pass a children's privacy law and forget about the fact that they got to deal with their parents, right? I'm like, can we actually have the conversation about privacy, which actually will also protect children? Again, going back to my earlier point, I think there are so many issues that are being layered on top of this. And don't get me wrong, I have children. I think there's a need to have comprehensive privacy that tags on the existing privacy legislation that protects young people. But it's also very problematic if we're not looking at privacy in general and the culture of privacy, which is, I think, something that we keep missing the mark with by going into these rabbit holes. Well, let's make it about AI. Well, can you solve privacy with AI when you got a whole lot of issues to deal with? Can you solve privacy with just, regulating children potentially and creating additional guardrails on their parents who have no access to privacy? So, for me, I think Congress has not yet, and Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the problem is we've not had an existential threat on the privacy level, but we've had existential threats on these other levels. And that is sort of misguiding the conversation around what should be the fundamentals that we should be looking at as we build these more technologically sophisticated systems.
Yeah, I think that, what you're talking about is kind of this tension between light touch regulation to make sure that we have an industry in AI that can develop and flourish versus heavier regulation to prevent some of the excesses. I think facial recognition, which you talked about, is a really good example of why regulation is needed in this area. When you let the genie out of the box and you don't put any guardrails around it, then you find a lot of violations. Facial recognition has been used and abused against minority communities. Black community, for example, has a lot of examples of how people have been misidentified by that. Facial recognition has been used with databases of licenses that the government is taking to identify people. None of this was foreseen as part of the facial recognition, but there's also nothing that prohibits it. AI, to me, is one of those technologies that kind of obliterates the responsibility of individuals over their data in a way. There's this whole narrative that people are responsible for controlling their data and that you control how much data you turn over to different companies. But network privacy is here now, and data brokers showed in a very specific and very high way how easy it is to get information about anyone, even the information that you haven't provided. So AI has this potential to kind of create all this data about you that you don't have any input on or output on. I did an example today. I went on ChatGPT and I said, give me a bio of Carlos Gutierrez, Deputy Director of LGBTTech.
Oh, no.
Why would you do that?
I was going to say, what?
And it turns out that I have experience in project management and technical backgrounds that I've never knew I had. And I have a very nice bio that's very technical. I could really go in-house at an IT team somewhere, according to this bio. The point being, I have no recourse here. I have no idea why the system, where that they found that. I have no way to contact someone to fix it. So this whole concept has changed completely because the inputs and outputs of AI are completely in a black box, and we don't have any control over that. So regulation is important to keep companies honest and to build in some accountability, because individual accountability as a concept doesn't work in this space.
I kind of liken it. So I don't know how many people have high school students at home. And it's sort of like my daughter said, why do I have to learn algebra, right? And I said, you've got to start with algebra 1. Then you got to go to algebra 2. In fact, sometimes you do pre-algebra. And it dawns on me what you're talking about is we don't have the fundamentals down. We're not going to be successful in algebra 2 and trigonometry, whatever comes next, if we don't have the fundamentals down. And that, as watching my daughter, her inability to have some of those fundamentals is getting in the way of her being successful in that space. And I think that's where we're sort of in this quagmire where, to your earlier point, if states determine the rules, it's going to make it even more difficult for Congress to come up with a national standard. And at this point, as the technology has evolved into now generative AI formats, we must get a handle on what can be collected. And again, for this community, that matters because we're already not represented in these systems. And if we are, we're probably not represented in the ways that we show up. But to add the lack of any type of guardrail to what can be collected could be even more dangerous.
I appreciate this discussion. So my father was a professor, and on his quizzes, he'd always start off with the easy questions first with students, and then get a little harder. Probably enjoyed kind of making them squirm. I don't know, but so I want to get into some tougher questions. It's easy to beat up on the idea of not having guardrails and all that. I mean, easy with, of course, a lot of experience. But I want to get into the question of this. I like the way you phrased it, the culture of privacy, because in our culture, we have folks in the room here they have their phones out, they have laptops, right? The chances are 90% of folks in this room have accessed some sort of platform at some point today where they've given a little bit of their information, geolocation, device ID, their likes and dislikes. And so let's talk a little bit about the trade-off. So I'm a passionate pragmatist, and I think this is where I struggle, because we all love the idea of having full privacy and knowing that our information will not be sold among different entities, that the government won't get a hold of it, that corporations won't get a hold of it. But at the same time, a lot of the products and services that we use require us to give a little bit of information. And if you choose not to give that information, then you don't get access to that product. And is it, in the past, it's been amazing to see how Congress has tried, there's been the concept of paying for privacy, right? If you pay $15 a month, then we won't take any information from you, which again, creates a whole other set of equity issues. Since we have 5 minutes left, and I want to use Since Nicole, I want to be a little selfish with your time here. We'll start off with you, but just talk a little bit about the trade-offs, right? Like our culture is such where we are so used to doing it, we don't really think twice about it. Are you optimistic about a world where we can actually avoid giving our personal information, or where that information flows will be limited? Are you optimistic about that? Talk about the trade-offs a little bit.
Well, again, the title of my book is Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, out in February, Brookings Press. Listen, I talk about that in my book, right? We have basically transitioned from an analog society where we had a lot more agency of going into big box stores or engaging with real people. And now we actually are highly dependent on the internet to get things done. We saw that a life experiment when we went into the pandemic, where the only thing that you could do was get online if you needed healthcare, educational resources, unemployment benefits. So we have definitely become a community, a world where global internet matters. And shame on us for still having a digital divide, because we've been working on this for 6 presidential administrations. Amelia knows. We've been working on this. We know what this looks like. So when it comes to the trade-offs, every day we make trade-offs. We make trade-offs to give our face at airports because we want to make sure we can get on our plane on time. We make trade-offs to share our health data because we want to make sure we can get access to a secondary care physician so we don't have to take 2 buses, particularly for our community members where transportation is an issue. But those trade-offs don't necessarily mean that you should be exploited. And I think that's why this conversation of trading off, well, let's get people to pay for privacy. Carlos and I have been on the same page for this. That's like asking people who are broke, go give some blood and get $5. We have no more blood to give in terms of how we as a community have used our data. Our data has been used for great discovery and we've not been paid for it. Just look at people like Henrietta Lacks and others who cured cancer and other diseases, incurable diseases. We've learned so much from us. And it's important for us to think about those trade-offs and educate our community on that. This is unfortunate at this day and age that privacy is not a civil rights community issue. We talk about it here in Washington, D.C., but we need everyday people to talk about how important it is to have this last digital asset. This is the last remnant of what it means to have some agency over your information. And as you talked about earlier, KJ, a grandmother sitting on the other side of DC who loses her identity could also lose her house. So it is just really important that we have trade-offs that improve the quality of our life, but we do it in a way that it's informed, that we know that just because I gave information here, it's not going to show up as a cookie later and somebody's going to be asking for my Social Security, that it's not, particularly in generative AI, that my privacy is now my image, my voice, that can be recurated and generated to scam me. These are important questions. And again, I hope Congress is listening, or somebody from the Hill, because it is so important that we address this as something that is part of this culture that we've created. You know, there's this misnomer that young people don't care about their privacy, but Pew has told us over and over again that they do. And so again, having these conversations and really doing an all hands on deck strategy with our communities at the local level might help to sort of make this an issue of trade-offs are no longer acceptable if it means it has larger implications for me. And I apologize, I have to leave. I kind of don't want to drop the mic and go. That's how I know, right? In the history of hip hop's 50th anniversary, I'm not going to do that.
Nicole, I hear you have a book coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Judan, don't kill me, please.
Sure.
You guys keep talking.
All right, thank you so much. We can give her a round of applause as she makes her way off the stage. I'll let you answer the same question, Carlos, just in terms of trade-offs and, again,
Yes.
is there a world where we can limit where our information goes?
Okay, so I am less optimistic than Nicole is about this, and I feel like I'm like the Eeyore of this panel. I'm really not a negative person about tech, but in this subject, I do feel like we do not have as much control as we can, and our choices actually matter less and less every day. In this age of network privacy, where we're only as private as our kind of most social friend on the internet. I may not post pictures from a party, but if I go to somebody's 40th birthday party, they may post those pictures and tag me. I may opt out of being tagged, but some AI system can still scan those faces and use my stuff for face recognition. You can look at something like forensic genealogy. You know, I may not be on Ancestry.com. I may not provide any information about my family history, but if a third cousin that I've never met before, or an uncle that I have no contact with decides to go on ancestry.com, federal law enforcement or state law enforcement can use that data to find me. It's not something I control over. So I'm less optimistic about NICOL about being able to opt out of this system. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things we can do that, you know, to protect our information, but I do want to leave a caveat here that I don't feel like an individual responsibility to protect the data is workable as a system anymore. We don't control our data that way, and there's so much of it out there that we don't have the ability to control it that way.
I love how we went from a panel to a fireside chat. So a discussion here.
Now it's a conversation between you and me, so you got to weigh in now.
So I'll just say, because I did have a question about like what makes you hopeful about the future of privacy, and I think all of your points are valid. And I'll add that I do think the conversation around AI is starting to bring up the topic of privacy again. We saw today there was a hearing on the House on artificial intelligence, and a number of civil society organizations, Center for Democracy and Technology, UNIDOS, I think Open Technology Institute, all sent letters to Congress saying, hey, great, AI is great. We're very excited about the innovation here, but it's also important to get national comprehensive privacy. So I'm optimistic in that sense that the two go hand in hand, but I think everything you said makes a lot of sense. I do think, just as a closing question, you know, what can we as a group full of advocates, industry, nonprofit, government agencies do today and in the future to protect ourselves and to advocate for the future of privacy?
I think it's a great question. And thank you for letting me end on a hopeful note and not a negative note like I've had. No, I think this gathering, I think, is an incredible example of what can be done by civil society. Like the conversations we're having here and raising these issues for the different communities, the work that HTTP is doing in this field is astounding. We do have an impact. When we speak to legislators, when we speak to lawmakers, when we speak to companies, there is an impact there. I talked about how the first 5 or 7 years of LGBTTech was just kind of explaining why those LGBTTech exist. I feel there has been an evolution in the conversation where companies and legislators kind of understand that there are issues around privacy that are unique for marginalized communities. So now we can get into more nuanced conversations. We can really get into the dirt and dig at this rather than spending all of our time educating as to why this is an important issue. So the work that we're doing, the work that the advocates in this room are doing is super crucial and so impactful, because we've heard from so many legislators and people within companies how helpful our perspectives are to drive a narrative that they want to drive. So at a very minimum, we're providing tools to friends and allies that may not have the tools or may not have the time to go as deep as we do into these issues. We can provide them with a shorthand or a blueprint to say, here are the issues, here are the numbers, this is a really big deal. Go fight the battle and we'll help you fight it. So I'm very optimistic about the fact that the conversations are evolving, and I think they're becoming more sophisticated around marginalized communities, and my hope is that we can just get deeper into it and that we don't have to keep explaining why it's different for marginalized communities and why it's not, it's something that should be paid attention to.
I love that we got to end on a positive note. Let's all give Carlos a round of applause. Thank you. All right.